Congratulations on receiving a grant from the Coastal Conservancy, and thank you for the work that you do. We are very excited to help fund your project. And everything that we're covering today is also outlined in the Grantee manual found on our website under grants and in the resources for grantees tab. This is shown by a yellow circle on the slide. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to your project manager and they'll be checking in with you as well. Next slide, please.
Thomas, you're muted.
Thanks. I'm going to quickly mention acquisition projects as they follow a different process than the rest of our grants. Grantees with acquisition projects should set up a time with your project manager to discuss the process for acquisition. But the general process is to 1, execute the grant agreement, 2, provide the acquisition documents to the Conservancy for review. The documents are listed on the screen and include an appraisal, preliminary title report, purchase and sale agreement, draft escrow instructions, and preliminary closing statement, among others. And SEC will prepare a draft offer to dedicate and send that to you for review. The offer to dedicate will be recorded during closing to ensure that the property is used for the purposes outlined in the Conservancy grant. Once all these items are finalized, the grantee can then submit an invoice request letter to the Conservancy. And we have a template for this, and this should be done at least 20 business days before close of escrow to ensure processing time. The check is mailed directly to escrow, and your project manager will send you resources, including an acquisition checklist. Again, I recommend setting up a time with your project manager to discuss the process. If there are any questions about acquisition, we can take them now, if there are any.
I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but if anyone has any questions specific to acquisitions, go ahead and raise your hand or drop it in the chat now. I don't see anything. I think we can move on.
Great. Moving on to the process for all of our other projects, including planning, implementation, Explore the Coast program, and our wildfire program. This graphic provides a high-level view of our granting process that you will go through from start to finish. We will go into detail on each of these topics, and we'll pause a few times for questions. And the first step is to execute a grant agreement, which outlines the terms and conditions of the grant between your organization and the Conservancy. And you can review our typical grant conditions in the grantee manual while your project manager is drafting your agreement. Please let them know if you have any questions. Your project manager will send it in DocuSign for signature. Make sure you read the agreement before you sign. And as part of this process, you will need to submit Standard Form 204, which provides us with the address where reimbursement checks will be sent. You need a 204 even if you've had a Conservancy grant before. And when your project manager is drafting your agreement, it's important to discuss your project schedule with them, as they will be identifying 3 important dates that will be specified in your agreement related to the completion of the project and closeout of the grant. 1, the work completion date. That is the date that all work that you plan to bill to the Conservancy for will be complete. No work after the completion date can be billed to the grant. Number 2, final request for disbursement date, the date that you submit your final report and final invoice, also called the request for disbursement. This is generally this date is set 1 month following the completion date. And finally, the termination date. This is the termination of your contract with the Conservancy and is typically set 3 months after the work completion date. For construction projects, this date will be 20 years after the completion date, as the agreement requires that all improvements be in place and maintained for at least 20 years. And acquisition grants also extend out 20 years. And your agreement comes with a grant agreement number that will be used in invoicing and other documents. And conditions precedent to disbursement. Your agreement will have a conditions precedent section. You cannot start work until you have satisfied all of your conditions precedent and you have received a notice to proceed from your project manager. And the typical conditions are listed here. We will go through each of these. And one is the board resolution. The resolution tells us that your governing body has agreed to enter into this agreement with the Conservancy and identifies who is authorized to sign the grant agreement. There's a template online, but you may have your own version of this that you would like to use instead. Moving on to insurance. We currently require $2 million in liability for construction projects and $1 million in liability for planning projects. The State Coastal Conservancy no longer needs to be listed as a certificate holder. We just need to see proof of insurance. And insurance requirements may differ according to your grant. Refer to the agreement for specific requirements. If it's a construction project, you may need to meet bonding requirements, but only if you contract with someone for more than $250,000. And if you need specific insurance for this grant and it increases your premium, you can charge your Conservancy grant for that extra charge. Make sure that you talk to your project manager about this and save documentation of this price increase. Now, here's a list of common insurance minimums. We talked about general liability, but here are the minimums for automobile liability, workers' comp, watercraft liability, course of construction, or property insurance. These will be dependent on your grant. For instance, if you aren't using a watercraft, you don't need to get watercraft liability insurance. And refer to your grant agreement to see what your insurance requirements are and reach out to your project manager if you have questions. Now we'll take a pause to answer a few questions. Kara will call on hands that are raised or read them from the chat.
I don't see any questions in the chat yet. So if folks have questions, you can raise your hand or drop them in the chat now. I don't see any questions, so I think it's okay to move on.
Well, we'll continue along. Still working through our conditions precedents list. The next up is the work program. So the work program is a roadmap that defines the task, deliverables, project schedule, and task level budget for the project. It tells us how you will complete the project, and it's the document that will eventually guide your invoicing. We have a template on our website, and when you open it up, you will see instructions on how to fill it out in orange, like shown on the screen. It may take a few drafts and revisions between you and your project manager to finalize this document. It is a living document and can be modified during the course of the project with approval by your project manager, and you can submit a request for a revised work program when needed. Now we're going to go through each section of the work program. At the top, you will fill in the project description, which provides a concise, high-level summary of your project, stating its goals and what will be done to achieve them. It typically can be one paragraph, but for more complicated projects, having a longer project description may be more appropriate. You can use the description from the grant agreement or staff recommendation as a good starting point. You will then define the scope of work by task. Common categories of tasks include project management or grant management, design, community engagement, tribal engagement, environmental review, permitting, implementation, and monitoring. You can also use subtasks to organize your activities if you'd like, but when you submit invoices, you will only be categorizing your activities under the overall task. And you can work with your project manager to tailor the task to fit your project. And for each task, you will also define deliverables, which are documents that you will submit as part of the project. You will be asked to provide an overall schedule for the project by task. Here's an example of a schedule. As you can see, you will use the task number, task title, and deliverables from the scope of work above and provide an estimated start and completion date for each item. This table will then be copied to the progress report to track deliverables, but more on that later. And then next up is the budget for each task, which is critical for invoicing. This will be copied onto the request for disbursement. Remember that a simple budget will allow for flexibility. You do not need to list the project costs from other funding sources for this project in your work program unless matching funds are required by your grant. Though your project manager may still ask separately for total project costs. Then in the budget detail section, you will be asked to describe what the budget will be used for. Your project manager will use this to make sure all costs and activities billed for align with your approved tasks. You will list out things like travel, equipment, and food costs in this section. You will also describe staff time. So list the job title and description of work for staff billing to the grant. In the work program, you don't need to provide information about hourly rates or numbers of hours worked, but you will need to provide that information when you submit an invoice. And then please check with your project manager early if you plan to use stipends for your project. For stipends, cash payment is allowed, but not things like gift cards or transit passes. For indirect costs, they can't be more than 20% of your overall grant. Please make sure to work with your accountant to come up with an indirect cost rate that can be supported in case of an audit. And for subcontractors, you will need to provide the name of the subcontractor, their qualifications, which usually includes a website link, and a description of their work for review and final approval by your project manager. And please note that all organizations that receive funding from the Conservancy are required to meet strict accounting standards. While rare, there's always the possibility of an audit, so it's the responsibility of all grantees to use generally accepted accounting principles published by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. And then finally, the plan for acknowledgement. The Conservancy requires physical acknowledgements such as signage for restoration and acquisition projects seen on the photo to the left. The softer acknowledgements are required for all projects, including communication materials that mention your project, like the photo on the right of a social media post. Some other examples of softer acknowledgements are website announcements, press releases, and program brochures. Funding recognition out in the world for the public to see helps to ensure that future funding is made available to our programs. So with that wraps up the conditions precedent section. And we understand that the conditions precedent may take a lot of staff time to complete. If this is a hardship, please talk to your project manager about charging some staff time to your grant before you get your notice to proceed. All right. Once all the conditions precedent to disbursement have been approved, your project manager will send you a notice to proceed or start work letter. Remember, you can't start work on your project until you receive this letter. You can begin work on your project on the date shown on the start work letter at the top. Work that occurs prior to this date cannot be billed to the grant. The exception is billing staff time for work on conditions precedent preparation with prior approval from your project manager. Now you're ready to start your work. And again, we're going to pause here to take a few questions.
There's a question in the chat. It says, can you repeat if IDC can or cannot be more than 20%? And can you please review direct and indirect expenses and advances?
For indirect costs, I know that it cannot be more than 20% of your grant, but your rate can, I think your rate can be more than 20% as long as the total indirect costs you're claiming do not exceed the 20% of your total grant award. And then for direct and indirect expenses and advances, do you want to come off mute and kind of ask your question?
Sure. If you can go back to your slide with the picture of the direct and indirect costs there. Previously, front was covered, and it looks like in the slide it's an indirect expense. Is that what I'm seeing?
Oh, the A should be grantee expenditures and B is subcontractors. So you're right, you're seeing indirect under direct, which is confusing. So when we get to the RFD form, you'll see that there's a section A and a section B, and section A is actually grantee expenditures. And then within that are the direct costs and the indirect cost rate. And then section B is subcontractor costs. Is it more clear now? Sorry about that.
Not at all. I'm sorry.
It's a good note for a slide edit. And then we're going to go over advanced funds a little bit later, if that's okay. We can take a question then.
Okay. Thank you.
But just to clarify on this slide specifically, the budget details section in your work program is where you'll explain what you'll be using the grant budget for. So if you have costs for any materials and supplies that you are incurring yourself, you can describe them here. That way your project manager knows that you'll be charging the grant for those expenses. And then any costs that you're planning to contract out will go under section B, subcontractor costs. Are there any other questions?
Is that clear what a direct cost is versus an indirect cost? Ask the question, Jolene.
I'm still having trouble with it, but
Okay,
it
yeah.
just might be the way that it's being explained at this time. Maybe I'll catch up later. I don't want to hold everybody up.
No, I think it's an important question. So direct costs are specific costs that you incur for the project specifically. So if you need to buy, like the picture shows, boots and hats and field gear, some projects have like field equipment that are purchases that are made specific to the project, that are costs specific to the project, and you charge for 100% of that cost because it's necessary to implement the project. And that's also same thing for travel. Travel that's specific to the project would be necessary to implement the project, and you can charge 100% of that cost up to the, consistent with the travel reimbursement rates. Same thing with any other materials and supplies. There are other materials and supplies that might be like office related or like phone bills or things that support the project, but are also spread out amongst other work that's not project specific. And those costs are typically built into an indirect cost rate. And so that's why there is an indirect cost rate, because you have costs that are needed to support the project, but they're not specific direct costs for this project. Does that help at all?
A little bit more, but some of the items highlighted in the slide as being indirect expenses aren't included in our NICRA rate. So that's where I'm having trouble understanding. Is it just the slide, or are some of these specific items allowed to be charged to the grant if our department is working 100% on this project?
Can you give an example?
Like
of
rent.
cost? Yeah, so rent, for example, if you're renting a lab to raise seeds for your project specifically and only for the term of the project, that could be a direct cost. If it's rent for an office that's being used to work on this project, but also on other projects or activities, then that would have to be captured in the indirect cost.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Thanks. I understand what you're saying. Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. If anyone else does have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself or drop it in the chat. And if not, we'll go ahead and move forward. I don't see anything. Let's move on, and then we can take more questions at the end. Thanks. Okay, the next section we will go over is progress reports and invoicing. These are important as it's how we track your project and how you get paid. To get reimbursed for project expenses, you should invoice no more than monthly and no less than quarterly or every 3 months. Quarters are typically January to March, April to June, etc., but there is no set calendar as long as you bill at least every 3 months. The Conservancy does enforce invoicing deadlines, and if you fall severely behind, there is a risk that we will ask you to stop work on your project until you get caught up on your invoicing. Reminder that you may not invoice for work prior to the start date of the project, which is the date on the notice to proceed. Invoices cannot cross over into a new fiscal year. Our fiscal year calendar runs from July to June. So you can bill up to June 30, and then for any work after that, you'll include it on your next invoice starting July 1. In other words, you can't have one invoice that covers both June and July. Invoices consist of the progress report, request for disbursement form or RFD, and backup documentation that supports expenses listed on the request for disbursement form. All of the documents should be combined into a single PDF and emailed to invoices@SCC and CC your project manager so they can review the documents. You'll send deliverables separately to your project manager. This is an example of the RFD form. There are 2 pages to fill out. The cover page summarizes expenses from the billing period and overall funds spent, and the second page breaks down each expense by type and task. We have this form in both PDF and Excel formats. The form can be found on our website. Here we have page 1 of the RFD. And again, this page summarizes all expenses from the billing period and funds spent to date. The address in blue in the upper left corner must match the address listed on the STD 204 form or payee data record form that you filled out during the grant agreement drafting process. This is the address where checks will be sent to. If you'd like checks mailed to a different address, like a PO box, ask your project manager about filling out an additional form. The task budget section highlighted in yellow should be copied from your work program. If task 1 is project management, the left column should say task 1 and project management, followed by the task budget in the next column. Costs incurred this period is the amount of costs you are billing to each task this period. Total cost to date are how much has been billed to each task to date. And finally, the remaining balance for each task. The form will calculate that for you. Our withholding policy recently changed. Previously, we withheld 5% from each invoice. Under the current policy, we withhold the final 5% of granted funds or $100,000, whichever is less. So we don't withhold anything from each invoice anymore. It's just withheld until the end, at the end, and then you request the release of the withholding on your final invoice at the end of your grant once the project is complete and you've submitted all of your final deliverables. And that's highlighted in the red is how much, that the highlight in the red shows how much will be paid before it's withheld on the final invoice. So that's the amount minus the 5% or the $100,000. Page 2 of the RFD further breaks down the expenses listed on page 1. The first section, section A, lists all the grantee expenditures. That's what we were referring to before. These include labor, subcontractors, and direct costs. Under labor, you'll list each title, hourly rate, number of hours worked, and task number. You do not need to submit timesheets, however, you should keep these in the event of an audit. For subcontractor charges, you'll list the company name, invoice number, amount, and attach their invoice as backup. In section 3, you'll include direct costs such as materials, equipment, travel, etc. You must attach a receipt for each cost. Section B is the indirect cost. The indirect cost rate must match the indirect cost rate listed in your work program. The grand total at the bottom of this page should match the total on the first page. Each subcontractor cost must be supported by an invoice that includes a description of work completed and how much it costs. A subcontractor provides a service through a contract with the grantee. We have some examples listed here. Here are some examples of backup documentation for other costs. Some things to note. You must include paid receipts for materials and supplies. Online purchases must show as shipped. Bank statements are not sufficient backup documentation. Please remember to save all of your receipts. Travel reimbursement rates can be found on our website. To better support our grantees, we've updated our travel rates. If you've been awarded a grant with us before, be sure to check out the new rates. We reimburse personal vehicle mileage costs at state rate. Currently, as of January 2025, it's 70 cents per mile. The table shows an example of how to document mileage reimbursement. Please include the date, locations, mileage, and total amount. Or travel can be reimbursed for gas with receipts and the cost of a rental car. Our lodging and per diem rates now match the federal rates. This information can be found in our travel reimbursement rates found on our website. It can also pay for parking fees and tolls that are incurred during your project. Receipts are needed for all costs. All RFDs or invoices must include a progress report. We have a progress report template for you to use found on our website and in the grantee manual. Progress report period is the same as the invoice billing period. In the progress report, you will provide an overall project update and describe project progress made in that period per task. These descriptions should support the costs that are being billed. The progress report also includes a deliverables table to track submittals. We do love photos and stories. Please send these directly to your project manager. Our grants are reimbursement based, meaning grantees incur costs and then we reimburse the grantee for those costs. We created an advanced funds program in response to the needs of some of our grantees, particularly smaller nonprofit organizations who are unable to cover the upfront costs of a project, as it would lead to significant financial burden. The Conservancy will prioritize recipient grantees serving disadvantaged, low-income, and under-resourced communities or organizations with modest reserves and potential cash flow problems. Please speak with your project manager if you'd like to request an advancement of funds. Please note that grantees must deposit the advanced funds in a federally insured interest-bearing account for which deposits, including interest and withdrawals, are tracked. And finally, you've completed your project. So how does it all get closed out? For an implementation project, we typically require that your project manager conduct a site visit at the end of the project to view the completed work. We also like to join in celebrating the completion of your projects. Please invite us to any other closing activities such as a community event or ribbon cutting. Next is submitting all project completion documentation. You need to submit all final deliverables to your project manager. Next, submit your final RFD and report. Make sure to check the box on your RFD to release the withholding. Finally, there are many guidance documents, templates, and examples on our website under Resources for Grantees, as well as our Technical Assistance page. And Sally, we have a few minutes, so Sally's going to give a little demonstration on how to find those on our website. Then we can take some more questions.
Great. All right, so if you navigate to our Coastal Conservancy website, scc.ca.gov, you'll land on our homepage. Again, you go to Grants, and then you can click Resources for Grantees. And on this page, you will find the Grantee Manual, which has lots of links and goes over everything that we discussed today. And as you scroll down, we also have some resources for invoicing, and the Advanced Fund Program as well. And that's all under Grants and Resources for Grantees. That's it.
Any questions? Go ahead and drop them in the chat or raise hands. Again, we will be sending out the slides from the presentation, and we will also link the presentation on our website, so you can find it there. And your project managers are always a very helpful resource if you have any questions about what we went over. Not seeing any questions. Do you want to stop the recording, Thomas?
Sure.